Welcome to Movie Heaven, Movie Hell with me, Simon Aitken, and
I'm Keith Eyles, and we are both independent filmmakers who enjoy discussing movies and related media. And for this special Blade Runner episode, we are pleased to welcome back to the podcast the excellent filmmaker and documentarian, Charles de Lauzirika. So welcome back, Charles.
Thanks for having me yet again.
You're almost like one of the family now. You hardly even need introduction anymore. So thank you so much for joining us. This podcast a little bit different than usual, in so much as, even though this is obviously one of those sort of landmark films, that's definitely the sort of thing that we normally talk about. Whereas we normally sort of pick to talk about something that's either very topical in the moment, or one of, a film that we want to cover, or by a particular director, or indeed something that we've worked or are working on. In this case, this has actually been a listener request, apparently, right, Simon?
yes, that's right. Yeah. So
do we know who?
Well, it's one of the listeners from YouTube, so
Okay, well, it's good to know we've got listeners for one thing. But yeah, I mean, it's always we do take requests. Why not? And it's always good to talk about films that we enjoyed and films that we've grown up on. So why not Blade Runner? Indeed.
Why not?
indeed.
Why not? So, I guess the best way to sort of approach this as a sort of jumping off point, because obviously there's so much to talk about here, is as we usually do, sort of what our involvement was, how we came across it, and sort of what it means to us. And I guess the person in the most unique position here for that one is probably you, Charles, and you're obviously the guest. So do you want to kick things off, or would you prefer me and Simon warm things up?
Whatever you want. I mean, I can kind of talk, I guess, a bit about my first viewing and how my love of the film evolved, and where I kind of ended up with it all. But I remember seeing it opening day, June 25th, 1982. At the Man Hollywood Theater, which is no longer there now. I believe it's the Ripley's Believe It or Not auditorium, or whatever it is, whatever show they do.
Oh my God, I don't believe it.
I remember my mom actually had to take me and some friends because it was, it's rated R, and we were 15 at the time, and but we all went down, and the film was promoted ostensibly as from the director of Alien with the star of Raiders of the Lost Ark. So you go in expecting some kind of combination of those two movies, and what we saw was very much not a combination of those two movies. And I remember we were just kind of speechless when it was over. I mean, one of my friends, as people are wont to do, they get right in your face the minute the fade out of the film happens. They're like, "What'd you think? What'd you think?" And I needed time to really process it. I mean, I was really kind of confused. I said, I don't know what I think. I need to stew on this for a while. So I did. And over the course of that summer, the summer of '82, I saw it a few more times in the theater. And each time out, I started understanding sort of almost the subliminal language of it, not just the amazing visuals or the kind of noir story or the really immersive soundscape. It was all that, but it was also this weird kind of almost spiritual level the movie was working on that I really was curious about, and over time became more and more intrigued by. And then it was like 3 years later, because as we all know, Blade Runner bombed in the theaters when it came out. It opened the same day as John Carpenter's The Thing, another excellent R-rated science fiction film, which also bombed. And so 3 years later, I was living in Barcelona, and I remember someone asking me what my favorite movies were, and I think I mentioned Star Wars and Raiders and things like that. And this person said, "What movie I love is Blade Runner," and that's when I started to realize that the film was starting to live beyond its failure, its box office failure, And that's when I started to realize that it was okay to like that movie, because I had a very complicated relationship with it. And I loved it, but it felt flawed, but like kind of like a diamond in the rough, you know? And I kind of felt like there's something under the hood of this movie, and I'm not sure what it is. And it took me quite a while to like feel comfortable, I don't know, kind of exploring my own love of the film, like the blossoming love of the film I was having, because it definitely took some time before I really fell in love with it. And then when I did, it was, you know, my favorite movie of all time. So, you know, that was kind of like the early years of my Blade Runner fandom. And then, you know, you saw other movies, other TV shows and music videos start to copy the style, and Blade Runner became a term that you could use in a sentence, like, wow, that was very Blade Runner, you know, or that weather is very Blade Runner-y, or that city looks like Blade Runner. And people got what you meant, you know. Years pass, I go to USC Film School, I start interning at various companies, and one of the companies I interned at was Scott Free, which was Ridley and Tony Scott's production company. And so, of course, to be there with, you know, the director of my favorite film was, you know, quite an honor and quite an education. And then, you know, I've told this story a million times, but then when I started producing his DVD and home video, you know, extras and supplemental features, I had always wanted to get to Blade Runner, and it took years before we got to it. But when we did, I feel like we really went all out and did a you know, robust release on all fronts. And that to me was almost like the culmination of that first day in 1982 when I saw the film, and I couldn't articulate why I loved it. And then that box set and the 5 discs and the documentary and the final cut, all, you know, my contributions to that was the ultimate expression of that original love that I had for the film. In short, that's my story.
And what a story. And I've got the tin next to me as we speak, actually, with the you know, the 5 discs and you know, the documentary and all that sort of stuff, which I've gone through in great depth over the years. So so we thank you for doing that, indeed. You've actually made me feel a little bit better, actually, sort of describing your, you know, your journey with it, if you like, because I remember from my perspective, I didn't see this until it came out on home video. So I guess it was 2 or 3 years later than it was released at the cinema. And I've obviously, you know, made no bones about the fact that I'm a massive Star Wars fan and a massive Indiana Jones fan, and, you know, love sci-fi and all of this sort of stuff. And obviously, you know, film noir, you know, all of those sort of elements that you mentioned. And I was really excited to see this. You know, I thought, oh, great, you know, Harrison Ford in a sci-fi movie, and I have to say that I found that the poster was, I guess, somewhat misleading, because the poster had sort of, you know, Harrison Ford there with this sort of really cool looking sci-fi gun type thing, and then this wonderful cityscape with flying cars and you know, all of these sort of sci-fi elements going on, and it kind of made it look almost like it was going to be some sort of, you know, super cool sci-fi action movie, you know, with the guy that played Han Solo and Indiana Jones in it. And so when I first watched it as a kid, you know, I wasn't ready for this sort of, you know, philosophical, existential journey, you know, with all these sort of deep undertones and meanings and everything. And obviously I was massively wowed by the spectacle of it, both visually and like you said, in terms of the soundtrack and the sound design and all that sort of stuff with it. But you know, I was, and obviously I saw the what was then the known now as the theatrical cut. So, you know, the version with the unenthusiastic voiceover by Harrison Ford and the shining ending and stuff. And you know, it wasn't really until, I guess, I don't know whether it was 91 or 92 that they, you know, Ridley Scott sort of jumped on the little sort of phase they had, or the fashion they had of director's cuts at that point, that I first saw it on the big screen. And you know, had quite a different experience with it, you know, watching it with more adult eyes and you know, a slightly more evolved brain, and you know, sort of had a much different appreciation of the film, of the deeper meanings of the film, and obviously preferred that cut of the film as well. You know, that kind of made more sense to me, and obviously was therefore delighted, you know, by the time we move on and even further and we get the you know what they're calling the final cut, where it's essentially, you know, it's like the director's cut but with all the little mistakes and bits and pieces improved. So and you know, still remains to now you know, an absolutely fantastic film in my mind, so much that I a couple of weeks back actually went to experience Secret Cinema Blade Runner, which was you know, a completely immersive experience, immersing us in, well, I was going to say Los Angeles of the future, but obviously it's technically only a year in the future, isn't it?
I have to say, I just want to say, Keith, that Los Angeles goes to hell in just a spate of a year.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny though, you know, you kind of look at it's a bit like they were saying about Back to the Future. It's kind of that they got sort of 50% of things correct and 50% completely wrong. So in terms of what the future is going to be, but yeah, so you know, for me, I love it, and I love the fact that we've got the opportunity here now to sort of dig into this and talk about it a bit more. But in terms of background, that's how I really sort of came to find the film. And you know, I admit, as a kid, I was looking for an action sci-fi movie starring Harrison Ford, and it wasn't, as I said, until I was a little bit older that that I really got to appreciate the film for what it was. And obviously, you know, Ridley still remains, you know, one of my favourite directors. So all good. Well, what about you, Simon?
Well, when I was a kid, I was massively into sci-fi. I'd watch anything that was sci-fi, and my mum taped it off TV for me, I think when it was shown on ITV, because I remember there being commercial breaks. So I don't know what year that was, but I imagine that was probably the late 80s, just because how long it takes to go from video to TV. And I just remember I was blown away by it. I mean, I really got into it the first time, and I watched that film quite a lot on VHS. I remember it was like the third or fourth film I actually bought on VHS. And then, of course, as you say, the director's cut came out in the 90s, and I got to see that on the big screen, and loved it even more now that you know, we had the happy ending taken out and the voiceover, because it's one of those things where it's kind of like when I watch it today, I know where the voiceover goes. I can remember what he says, what lines what he says, and but I don't miss it. But yet sometimes I feel it did fill in some of the, I guess, backstory to Deckard, but of course that then just makes him to be a normal guy and not possibly a replicant. So it kind of, the theatrical cut kind of takes away from that kind of mystery. But when I started to study film, when I started doing my course, I started buying a lot of making of books, and one of the first books I actually bought was Future Noir by Paul M. Salmon. And
yeah, I have a copy of that right here. Yes, very good book.
Yeah. I was actually able to buy it when I was over in the States, that back in '99, and I just loved the story of the making of it, because I was starting to learn about filmmaking. You started to learn that there's this other life the film has, and that's the making of. And when you're younger, when you watch films, you don't realise the sort of the effort that goes in, and some of the maybe turmoil, or some of the battles that go on to get these films made. And sometimes those stories are as interesting or more interesting than the actual film itself. So I was amazing to see that this film kind of more or less escaped than it was actually kind of made. It's that weird thing where there was so many things against it, yet it still came out and became this classic. I do think that the film gods were smiling upon it, even though I imagine everybody who worked at it on the time didn't think so. Yeah, so it's a film I go back to every year, and I watch, and I'm always seeing new things. I mean, I watched it today, and even today I was sort of noticing details in the frame that I've never seen before. And it's just it's a weird thing. It's a rewarding film. It rewards you for coming back and watching it again. I don't think you could ever get the full experience of just watching it once.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, for the longest time on the sort of home video release, I used to watch this film in 4:3 pan and scanned version with like a mono soundtrack. Yeah. And obviously it wasn't until I went to see the director's cut that I got to see it in the full aspect ratio, on a huge screen with a proper surround mix and all of that sort of stuff. And I mean, the attention to detail on that film, as with all of Ridley's films, to be fair, but the attention to detail and the world building is absolutely second to none. It is really rich, and like you said, it is one of those films that visually you can watch multiple times and keep sort of noticing new things and whatever, but also absolutely thematically as well. You can watch it, and you can watch it sort of from different points of view, and you can do the whole or the ambiguity, if you like, around Deckard. You can experience the film in different ways, and I think it's really great when a movie's able to sort of do that and work on those sort of multifaceted levels. And as you rightly said, I mean, that book, and indeed Charles's documentary, for anyone that's interested in filmmaking and the craft of filmmaking, but also some of the politics of filmmaking as well, would be wise to invest their time in watching that documentary and obviously listening to reading the book. For sure. And it's not a plug, Charles. It's
not a what? I missed what you said.
I said sorry. That wasn't a shameless plug either, Charles, for people to go out and buy it. But
shameless.
So, Charles, I was just wondering, did you have any involvement with a previous documentary about Blade Runner? It was made for Channel 4 with Mark Kermode, and I remember it was the first time they actually showed extra footage from the film, which was the Deckard visiting Holden in the hospital scene.
I helped out a little bit on that one. Andrew Abbott, who directed that, and Mark Kermode, both really great, talented guys, obviously. They were in LA shooting interviews for On the Edge of Blade Runner, which was their documentary. Mm. And we hung out a bit and grabbed some drinks and talked and whatnot. And they had to leave town, if I remember correctly, because this was back in like 2000, 2001. they had to leave town, and they didn't get Joanna Cassidy or Joe Turkel. So they asked if I would just pick up those interviews for them. So, they sent over the questions, and this is the first time I'd ever conducted interviews. So I was very nervous. And I basically just, literally just read off the sheet of paper that they sent over with not much else, but it was great because I got to meet Joanna and I got to meet Joe, and Joe Turkel especially was very, very funny, very lively character. And Joanna is just lovely, and I've seen her several times since, and she's great. So that was like the very first nibble for me in the world of documentary and documenting Blade Runner, and it was great to learn from Andrew and Mark, and just kind of watched how they assembled what they did, and I think their documentary is excellent, and certainly a completely different approach to why Blade Runner is an important film. I think it's more intellectual than mine. I think it's more it's just a bit of more philosophical and more involved in exploring Philip K. Dick's work and the origins of Duandre's Dream of Electric Sheep, as well as what the film means and how it resonates today, and how it captured a very realistic and credible future. So I feel like in a perfect world that would be a really nice companion piece to Dangerous Days, which is far more nuts and bolts and stories from the set and production facts, and and we talked about it. I mean, we talked about trying to include On the Edge of Blade Runner in the big 5-disc set, and I can't remember why exactly, if it was a rights issue or just we ran out of space because we had so much stuff. But I love their documentary. I think they always do a great job.
Yeah, well, I mean, you did include their Alien one on the quadrilogy box set, though, didn't you?
2 cuts of it.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. No, I mean, look, if there's room, I'm always up for including everybody. It's not I don't feel territorial or possessive about it. I'm like, let's give the fans everything we can give them. Yeah. And let them decide. Let them kind of go on, figure out what interests them. Because someone who there might be someone who's not interested in the production of it. They want to get the meaning of it. So that's where you could go to, like, On the Edge of Blade Runner, or someone wants, the juicy stories from the set, or how people react to certain challenges. Then they can go to my documentary. So it's, I'm all for just telling the story and creating a living archive of what went into a particular film and what its resonance is, afterwards, especially on older movies.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and you certainly you gave us that in spades with these sets, and of course the other thing that we're really grateful about as well is the fact that all the versions of the films are included, as opposed to only being able to get the latest version or the latest cut or whatever of the film. The fact that they're all there as a home media collector. That's what you want. You literally want to be a completist and have everything that exists out there on it, and this does include that. So that's fantastic, really.
Well, it's funny because there were so many people back then. We're talking about over 10 years ago, and even before that, when we first started trying to work on it. Where you saw other big special edition releases, especially movies that had multiple versions. And there was always some level of complaining from fans, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you include that? And the response from my other producer friends who worked on those projects was, you can't win. Someone's always going to complain about something. And then if the phrase existed back then, I would have said, hold my beer, because with Blade Runner, we did satisfy nearly everybody, because we left no room for dissatisfaction. It's like you got every version of the film as restored as best as we could possibly restore it, and it fully anamorphic, 5.1 Dolby. I mean, it was like we didn't half-ass any of that stuff, and even the work print, which was in terrible shape. I mean, even Warner Brothers was so gracious and generous to let us include that, and actually put as much work as we could in trying to salvage it, because it looked terrible. It looked like I'd been dragged behind a truck through gravel. We got that on the disc, so we have the full kind of like story or history rather of the edits. And if you have a particular version you like, it's there, And then on top of that, you get 47 minutes of deleted scenes. You get hours and hours of documentaries and featurettes. You get like every TV spot and trailer we could find. We even threw in B-roll from the behind-the-scenes footage, just raw, unedited, footage. So I do believe you can satisfy, maybe not 100%, but 99.9% if you just give the people what they want. And believe me, sometimes it's impossible. Sometimes for legal reasons you can't include something, or you don't have clearance to use something, or you run out of space, and it's just too cost prohibitive to include another disc. But, it was a perfect storm with Blade Runner because we got, I think, pretty much everything. I mean, there's always little things that you don't get. But on the whole, that first 5-disc release in 2007, I thought, pretty much covered all the bases. I mean, certainly all the important ones, and then a lot of unimportant, geeky ones, too. So I see no downside to that first release.
No, absolutely. I must admit, in 2007, that Christmas, when this came out, I literally, it took me a few days, but I'm fanatical enough that I actually did literally watch everything on there, everything, and thoroughly enjoyed it. Was informed and entertained and inspired and all of that good stuff as a wannabe filmmaker and a film fan of this type of movie. So and I just wish that all special editions that came out would be like this, but we try our best, I guess,
Well, not every film warrants this kind of treatment. I don't want to say it doesn't deserve this kind of treatment, but certainly there are films that deserve an in-depth, immersive, behind-the-scenes experience. But Blade Runner just had, with the 5 versions, with all the kind of contentious production history, with all that stuff, I mean, there's just so much material to include. Whereas you could have an equally or even more worthy film where there's just not much story there. It's like they had a good time, they made the movie, it turned out great, and that's, you can get that in a half an hour. So it's just Blade Runner had just so much meat on the bone in terms of the behind the scenes aspects of it, that it was, again, just like I said, it was a perfect storm of content and opportunity and the timing and just everything just kind of magically aligned on that one. And I've had other projects I've worked on which have turned out, I think, pretty great and that have also been pretty in-depth and immersive. But it's going to be really difficult to top Blade Runner.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the pinnacle, isn't it? Once you've done that, it's like everything else is there's no comparison to it.
Well, I mean, again, it's like it depends on the subject matter. But I think that, again, you could take something like Star Wars and have a field day with it and make, even a bigger release, because there's a lot of history to that as well. But just for whatever reason, Blade Runner just was just so primed for this kind of treatment because it hadn't really been done before. I mean, Criterion in the early days put out a Laserdisc, which was, I think it was the first time the film was presented in its original aspect ratio. And it included, I believe it had like a trivia section. It had some production factoids, but it was almost presented as like, not a game exactly, but it was, it was just kind of like more of a factoid section. And that was pretty much it, if I recall correctly. So, and that was Criterion, who are known for their, gold standard, special edition releases. So, considering that's all they could get away with back then, I think it's just amazing alignment of the elements and everything. We pulled it off in 2007, many years later. And again, keeping in mind that it hadn't been done before with Blade Runner, so it was completely all new virgin territory.
So is there like a film out there that you would love to do a documentary about? Any film?
I mean, there's lots. I mean, the thing is, a lot of them have already been done. So it gets to find something that maybe hasn't been done or hasn't been done well. And And I don't know, that's something I feel I don't want to share.
Oh, okay.
You don't want that in the public domain. Yes.
But, I mean, look, I think that you could still do an amazing Star Wars box set when these first 9 movies are done, and you could do a Skywalker saga box set, which could be amazing. There's all kinds. I mean, there's weird films that never got special edition treatment, but probably wouldn't justify the cost of like that kind of I don't know, that kind of all in special edition box set approach. But again, it's like I hesitate to go into them. I just put, look, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And only, the times have changed too. The industry has changed. The appetite for this stuff has changed, and it's not what it used to be. And so you have to kind of pick your battles. And if you see an opportunity where the director or the producers and the studio have a certain level of excitement for something, and you go in and you say, "Great, here are my ideas," and they like them, then you're off and running. It's just that opportunity is kind of few and far between these days. It's not that the studios don't want to put out a good product. They do. It's just they have to look at the bottom line and ask themselves, how many people are going to buy this set, and will it justify the cost of doing a director's cut or restoring the film or traveling around the world and shooting 80 interviews like we did on Blade Runner. It's just like these are all questions that have to be asked before they start spending money. And that's just the world we live in. I mean, and I totally understand it. That's why I always push for the most, but at some point the studio is well within their right to push back and say, well, we appreciate that you want to do this stuff, but we won't make any money back on it if we go that far. And that nowadays, because I've not on projects I've worked on, but I've heard of sales numbers for other discs that should have been huge, and they were like 5,000 or 6,000 units sold. And these are big titles with big fan bases. And I was shocked to hear this. I was like, how is that possible? I mean, there's literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of fans for this particular franchise, and you're only selling like 5,000 or 6,000 units. So I get it, and it's a shame, but people just stop. A lot of people got used to getting things for free. A lot of people found it very easy to pirate.
Yeah.
A lot of people wait for Amazon to sell things for, $5.99, and it's just, this all takes a toll on how much money the studio can spend, and that unfortunately has kind of, gutted the ultra big Magambo big set, kind of thing. You can't afford that type of stuff anymore.
Yeah. I'm sure. Streaming and things like that have kind of affected that model as well. In terms of home media, and obviously it's changing so quickly as well. I mean, we've now got UHD everywhere in the shops, and it doesn't seem like long ago that Blu-ray came out, even though it was some years ago now. But I guess I don't know whether this has an effect on stuff like that, but I'm sure it must have something to do with the economics down the line, as well. In fact, I on a similar subject, I read an interview regarding that there was a couple of years back, there was a high definition or singing or dancing release of the entire series of Star Trek The Next Generation. And it really was kind of a labor of love project where they'd gone back to all the individual assets and completely remastered it, and it was quite a painstaking process. And apparently, like you were saying, that the sales weren't strong enough for them to justify doing it for the other Star Trek series, like Deep Space Nine or Voyager. And the problem is, a lot of the assets in terms of the visual effects side of things, where they were finished for television, don't actually exist in a HD type format. They still exist in, in a TV type format, and they would have to literally go back to all the individual assets, right back to the 35mm negs and the VistaVision stuff, and then all of the visuals that would have to be then redone, in terms of the laser effects and stuff, because they were just in standard definition. So that there is quite a, people think, oh yeah, you can just remaster that and re-release it, but there is actually quite a lot involved with the various assets and elements to do that if they're not already in high definition, standard def, like many things were.
Yeah, no, that's true. And it's a shame, because so much great work was done right at the cusp of HD taking over, where certain departments were up and running for that type of stuff, to restore things or to, up-res things or whatever. And they weren't, because, some people weren't sure about what the next step was going to be. And it wasn't until literally a year later when they realized, oh, everything's going to go HD, but it's too late. We already missed our opportunity. And they go back and do that again. It's going to cost, we're going to have to double the money we spent. So, it's bad timing, bad decision making, but it's not bad decision making made out of, any kind of evil intent. It's just, you weren't aware of what was coming around the bend, and that always kind of affects things. I mean, in the case of Blade Runner, it kills me that we don't have Dangerous Days of deleted scenes in HD, but we were, again, right at that cusp of when we were working on it. Blu-ray still hadn't locked in as the preferred format for the next generation. It was kind of a war between Blu-ray and HD, and DVD was still thriving. Standard def DVD was still thriving. So it was kind of a question mark as to what the next step was going to be. So that's why it was sort of like, well, let's maybe hedge our bets or whatever. In retrospect, I really wish we had just, followed through. But, it's hopefully one day there'll be an opportunity to get around to make those HD.
Yes.
Yeah.
Important to save one's assets. And I guess nobody ever knows what the future's going to hold. We didn't know that what was going to happen to LA in a year from now.
Just you guys saying that makes me think that I know personally that at the moment my own films are only in HD, and the assets are in HD, and there's nothing higher than that. So years down the road, I don't know if these films will be available, because whatever the 8K 16K TVs are showing, I don't think my films will sort of match up to that. I mean, at least films that have been shot on film can actually be scaled to these different formats at the moment, just because of how rich film is, how versatile it is. But it does make me think there's going to be a whole lot of films that are going to be sort of lost down the road, because they were shot on today's media.
But honestly, I think it's the age of the film that's more important than the format, because I had a conversation weeks ago with a couple 20-somethings about Lawrence of Arabia. I asked them if they'd ever seen it.
Oh, right.
And they hadn't even heard of it. So
oh no.
Explained to them what it was and why it was important, and how David Lean, spent so much time on that film, basically, chasing the weather. This 6 months waiting for a sunset and whatever. I was telling them those types of stories, and they showed zero interest in it. And I'm thinking, okay, that film you could see in like 70 millimeter now, or they could do a beautiful 4K presentation of it, and it would be, it would look timeless. It would be as beautiful today as it was then, probably. And that's got nothing to do with the format. That's got to do with the perceived age of the film. I mean, even though the film is in glorious full color and has amazing epic scope to it, granted, it's whatever, 4 hours long with an intermission, but it does not connect for all these really sad reasons. And as much as I've tried to get younger people that I know to see older movies, I'm talking about movies from like the 80s. You know, it's difficult. You know, I mean, my fiance had, of the Indiana Jones films, she had only seen Kingdom of the Crystal Skull.
Ooh.
The longest.
Okay.
Yeah, what a shame. What a shame.
So I said, okay, well, I have to at least show you Raiders. And I was waiting for a retrospective screening, and then came up. So I just showed it to her on my big screen at home. I said, okay, well, let's watch Raiders. And she loved it. You know, she really did. Which is fortunate, because I would have had to have dumped her if she didn't. But no, that got me thinking. It's like, well, it's just that how do you convince people to try out, you know, older films? And it kills me to have to say the Raiders is an older film, because for me it's like it came out yesterday. But
yeah.
But you know, now I'm like, okay, can I show her Temple of Doom in a few weeks? Can I, you know, get her the last few years? You know, because you can't just power through these like I think we could. You know, you have to kind of like tiptoe and say, please, can I just please show you this film from like my childhood that was so important to me? So yeah, I'm not sure the format is going to weigh as heavily as you think. I mean, I'm sure it's an issue, certainly on like real issue, but I think just in terms of getting people to even see your films, it's going to be, I think, based more on what seems fresh and new and relevant versus what's good from whatever year it came out in, you know?
Yeah, there's so much out there, isn't there? It's that old. Oh dear, you know, I find that story about Lawrence of Arabia really sad. I mean, I could just imagine them watching it and saying, "Oh, come on, get across the desert already," you know. That beautiful shot, you know. But it is what it is.
Keith, didn't you have a similar experience with the kids you were teaching?
Yeah, I mean, back when I was teaching, I did find it frustrating because I remember, you know, very indulgently on my part, I did a thing where I did a bit of an experiment with the class about, you know, history of film and some of the stuff. And what I did was we did a season where we did a term essentially where we studied Psycho. But my whole framing thing for this was we played the original film at the beginning of the term, and then we discussed it across the term, and we looked at filmmaking and obviously the marketing around it and how times had changed there, and, you know, the whole thing about the toilets and, you know, all of that stuff we dealt with, you know, the different aspects. But then at the end of the term, I showed them the Gus Van Sant remake, and it was a little bit of an experiment to see, you know, which one they preferred. And it was interesting because, first of all, they all found the original Psycho, Hitchcock Psycho, kind of boring. And I was like, really? And they were like, oh, it's kind of long. And I'm like, what? You know, and all this. So I was kind of obviously taken back in disgust by that. And then what I found really funny when we watched the Gus Van Sant version was, again, it's perception after something's happened. All of these kids know Vince Vaughn as this kind of, you know, comedy goofball actor. Yeah. And obviously that was earlier in his career when he'd done Swingers and whatever, but you know, he didn't have the sort of history that he's had since. So of course they all found, you know, the fact that he was in the film hilarious, and sort of couldn't take it seriously from the start anyway. But it was weird. The overall vote at the end of the term was kind of 50-50. So you know, half the class preferred Hitchcock's version. Obviously, they all got an A. And no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. And then the other half preferred, you know, Gus Van Sant's version. And it's like, okay, well, fair enough. But, you know, and a lot of them attributed that to the fact that it was in color. And I said, yeah, well, you know, you have to understand, Psycho wasn't in black and white because color hadn't been invented. You know, that was a choice, and it was done for other reasons, and you know, and all this sort of thing. So it was quite interesting to discuss. But I have to say, yes, I was kind of shocked that you know, these young people didn't regard the film in the same way I do, and you know, again, that's life. I mean, bearing in mind that it was a classic old film when I first saw it. So, but yeah, it's just interesting how times change and how you know, how audiences perceive things. It's yeah, very interesting. But anyway, sorry, I've gone off on a total tangent, which has taken us way off from Blade Runner. So I apologise. That one listener that wanted us to do this Blade Runner episode will be, bloody hell, they've already talked about Psycho, damn it.
Well, you know, you can bring this all back to Blade Runner, that, you know, without talking about sequel, you know, it didn't really, I mean, even though, you know, a lot of film fans love Blade Runner, and people our age and, you know, geeks all over the world love Blade Runner, I mean, it just goes to show that the box office performance of 2049 kind of revealed that that was not a mainstream, you know, thing, a phenomenon. It was, I think, you know, Blade Runner's time was kind of white hot in like the 90s, and then kind of culminating in 2007. But even then, it was sort of like this kind of memory, you know, of this film being groundbreaking versus actually being vitally groundbreaking, you know, when it was. Because obviously the film was groundbreaking. It inspired all kinds of, you know, films and televisions and comic books and video games and everything like that. But 30 years later, you know, you have to ask yourself, besides the people that love the film, what are the kids today think? Because those kids grew up in a world where every future they ever saw in any format was inspired by Blade Runner. So it's like they get to see a sequel to that film, and they're sort of like, well, what else is new? You know, I've seen all this before. I've seen, you know, the big mega buildings and the flying cars and the neon and the steam and the rain and all the moody atmosphere. I've seen that in a bajillion other things, because they weren't there at the flashpoint when Blade Runner kind of wrote that visual language, you know, for the pretty much the first time, or at least crystallized it in that way for the first time. So that's where you have to ask yourself, you know, would the kids today appreciate Blade Runner, especially with its kind of slow pace, which I love, you know, but do the kids want to sit through that? I don't know. Can they you know, embrace the film's kind of like darker, more philosophical side? I mean, maybe they can, maybe some can, but I'm guessing most mainstream audiences, even grown-ups, probably would not connect the way we did back in the day. So, you know, you have to ask yourself, what's next? What's the next thing to get excited about? What's the next future that we haven't seen before? And when I interviewed Mark Romanek, who was one of the filmmakers we, you know, like Guillermo del Toro and Frank Darabont, and just we interviewed these other filmmakers who were inspired by Blade Runner, and I asked Mark Romanek, I said, you know, okay, we've seen the sterile, clean 2001 future, and we've seen the dark, dystopian Blade Runner future. What else is there? You know, because those are the kind of the two extremes between light and dark. And he said, well, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't tell you, because I would go make that movie, you know?
Exactly. That would be the next thing, indeed.
So when you ask something that people can get excited about and say, okay, that's a future I've never seen before, and get excited about for a modern audience, you know, that's a really tiny needle to thread, you know, really tiny, because so much has been done, and so many variations of what's been done has been done, you know,
yes.
And so many flavors of basically the same thing, that you have to really step out of our existence as human beings to kind of figure out, okay, what else is there? But when you do that, you lose the connection to your audience, I feel, because suddenly you're so off the grid in coming up with stuff that's just so wild, that it might be awesome to see, but will it connect with you as a viewer? Will you have a shared experience that allow you to say, I understand this world, I like this world, or I'm engaged by this world, I want to see more, you know? So I wonder, I hate to say it, I'm not suggesting at all that we're at kind of the end of human imagination, but I do wonder what else is there when it comes to the future that we in 2018 actually understand. Because the future of 2019 back in 1982, even though it was so exotic and strange and alien, it still was grounded in things that we were starting to see, and in the noir of older movies and the punk rock of the 80s. And it's just like it was still grounded in stuff we knew. It was just a whole new combination of those ingredients. And I just wonder, what is that next combination of ingredients that works as a credible, never before seen future, and yet we can connect to as humans? Like that's the question.
No, I wish I had the answer. That would be my key to success, I think, most definitely.
Maybe not. I mean, as we just said about Blade Runner, I mean, it took about a decade for people to catch up with it, to actually get used to that vision of the future. It took the Blade Runner influencing other directors to take that look on, and so come the 90s when the director's cut came out, it was people were used to seeing that, so they could get into it more. I imagine. I would love to have been there when it first came out at the cinema, and just to see the audience reaction, because I imagine for a lot of people it was like, what the hell is this?
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. I mean, it's as you rightly said, Charles, you have got the sort of two templates in film science fiction history, in terms of 2001 for the sort of sterile, clean looking future, and Blade Runner for the sort of dark and dirty vision of the future, and definitely everything that sort of come since as visually as drawn on one of those two films to a certain extent in their aesthetic, and obviously thematically, I mean, of course, science fiction had been exploring some of these possibilities in literature and art for hundreds of years before these films came along. But you think of the other films that have sort of dealt with some of the thematics of this. I mean, my old favorite that I always go to in terms of television is of course Ron Moore's vision of Battlestar Galactica with the humanoid type Cylons, being very inspired by Blade Runner, even down to the fact that they refer to them as skin jobs as a slang in the narrative. And more recently, in terms of actually what's on television at the moment, again, even though it was worked from a Crichton film and novel back from the 70s, but of course, Westworld is absolutely exploring those sort of philosophical themes around humanity and existence, and who has rights, whether you're created biologically or artificially, and all of that sort of stuff. So definitely those themes are still there, and today's generation are getting those stories and engaging with those stories, which are still sort of timeless and universal. But like you absolutely said, the key is, how is one going to visually move from those sort of templates? And that is indeed a very good question.
So what's the answer?
Well, if we knew, we wouldn't tell you.
if we knew, we'd be making it. We'd be filming it right now. So but yeah, I mean, it is an interesting debate for sure. This is the question as to sort of why Blade Runner is held in the regard that it is, and why it's certainly inspired our generation, our generation of filmmakers. It's very much on the list that people give of inspirational films. But the question is, what's that next generation of filmmakers going to draw from, or are they just going to go back to this?
Well, another thing is that when Blade Runner came out, the level of visual effects was, it was getting better and better. It was still in the post-Star Wars technological explosion, but every shot, I don't know how many shots there are in Blade Runner, like visual effects shots there are in Blade Runner, but it can't be more than 40 or 50. I mean, there's very few actual visual effects shots, if I recall correctly, versus something like Infinity War, where almost every shot is a visual effects shot.
Yeah, visual effects in every frame. Yeah.
Back then, it was sort of like an actual feat to pull off that world convincingly and to pull off those shots as beautifully as they did. Whereas now, don't get me wrong, it's still a ton of work, and it takes thousands of people and workstations creating these shots. But I remember when I was watching Infinity War, and I sat there and I was kind of just in awe of the scope of it, about how big the scale of it was, to the point where I was like, it's not that it wasn't impressive. It was almost like I was numb to it, and I felt like I can't compute what what I'm actually seeing technologically. I'm into it. I'm into the story. I'm into the character. I get what's happening. I totally understand the geography within the frame. I get all that stuff, and I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it on a very kind of like popcorn level. But when I started thinking about the enormous amounts of work, and then when you watch the end credits of Infinity War and you see like every visual effects company in the world pretty much worked on this movie, you realize that's like an army that you had to put together to create those shots, and then you say, okay, so I have the ability to create magic. Literally, it's like you're basically like a god now. You can do whatever you want in a movie. There's no excuse. Whatever you can imagine, you can actually do. Versus back in 1981 and 82, when they were making Blade Runner, they couldn't. It was like they were limited. They had huge limitations that they had to try to, punch through. So that's the other dynamic. It's like, yeah, we're talking about what could this other future be, or this other sort of new vision that we're hoping to imagine one day. But then on top of that, it's the achievement of it. It's like, okay, what's the big deal? It's like, yeah, you can imagine it. But now it's so easy. Again, the word "easy" is misused, but you know what I'm saying. It's like it's so doable now with the technology and the state of the art that we have, that the stunt of it is kind of removed. You know what I'm saying? It's like back when Blade Runner came out, that was like a stunt. Like they pulled off stuff that you just didn't know how they did it, and it was just you sat in awe of like simple things. And now you're seeing them actually literally destroying entire worlds and wiping out trillions of people. Spoiler. And it's just kind of it just kind of happens in these visual effects companies that, again, enormously talented armies of people, but it's done on such a regular basis now that where's the surprise when it happens, when you have like this level of visual splendor and scope? It just, I don't know, it's like a totally different world we're in right now, and I'm just wondering what is the next time speaking for myself, I am going to get super excited about a movement in filmmaking, or a style, or a technique, or even a director's kind of signature. I really feel like it hasn't really been since the 90s, and maybe like Tarantino and all the indie movies that came after him, that I felt inspired and can't even comprehend. Did you lose me?
No. I mean, I think what you're saying there is absolutely the viewpoint of watching it as a filmmaker. I mean, this is where us three talking here, when we watch movies, we do watch them as filmmakers rather than just literally an average audience person. So you're right. You do sort of think, oh well, they can do anything now, and the limitations of films like Blade Runner and whatever, around that time, were in some respects what made them so special and so good, were those limitations. But like you said, now, yes, it takes armies of people to make this happen, but you can sort of do anything. And we had a little while ago, we had on the podcast John Walsh, who is involved with the Ray Harryhausen Foundation. And we were talking about whether or not there will be a renaissance of, going back to old style visual effects in terms of, stop motion and motion control and models and things of that nature, whether that it will actually come sort of full circle and do that, and there be sort of a rise in that again, as well as things being produced via CG. And I don't know, what do you have any thoughts on that, Charles?
No.
Well, I just remembered a sort of a movement that kind of got me excited, especially when I started out as a filmmaker, was the Dogma 95 movement. I mean, the fact that, these guys just came up with a set of rules, and they, literally said, well, here you go make a film. It doesn't have to be, this big thing. It doesn't have to have special effects. You don't need to have music playing in the back, a score to it. And, that, I remember at the time that was kind of freeing. I mean, it was short-lived, but I remember at the time it was kind of, it was just a way of saying, well, we might be shooting these on like video cameras and stuff, but that's not what matters. It just matters that we're telling a story, and we're just stripping everything else away. It's just about the acting and the story, and I found that very invigorating when I first started.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of in that that almost like weird transitional period between analog and digital, wasn't it? It was kind of it was very much a sort of trend that that sort of spun out of that, the whole fact that we could record audio and video on a single device and all this sort of thing simultaneously, and you could shoot for an hour and all that sort of thing. It did kind of the tools, if you like, changed the way it was done, and weirdly it's kind of gone back full circle again, because then the DSLR movement, which we had in the last decade or whatever, sort of brought things back to only being able to shoot for 10 minutes at a time and having to sync sound separately and stuff like that. So it is interesting that it sort of goes in circles and trends, and definitely technology totally drives this stuff.
Well, it's interesting because the economics of everything have also changed since the original Blade Runner came out, where there's kind of no more middle class of film production anymore. I mean, everything is either over 100 million or under 1 million. And everything in between is far more rare than it used to be.
Television. It's television.
Yeah. Television is like the last hope right now. But I feel like, a film like Blade Runner, you couldn't make that today, like with that budget. Because I think adjusted for inflation, I could be wrong, but I feel like it's around 80 million. Versus like back then it would cost whatever, 35 million. But who makes an $80 million movie these days? Very few people, and you look at 2049, which costs over 200, which is, frankly, if you think about it, kind of insane. For a sequel 30 years after a cult film that bombed in theaters, that was crazy to spend that kind of money. So, but you kind of have to do it to compete in today's marketplace. So it's like either you make a $20 million Blade Runner, or you make a $200 million Blade Runner, but you can't really get away with a $90 million Blade Runner these days. And it's like, and I think that's the biggest problem of all, is like you're having this huge divide between basically a Dogma 95 movie and a Marvel movie. It's like there's just not a lot in between. I mean, there are, but it's increasingly rare. Versus when back in the 80s, they were pretty much mostly middle class movies, in terms of what they were spending. Like I mean, I think it was it Terminator 2, I think, was the first film that cost over $100 million to make, and people thought that was madness, and that would never get bigger than that, you know?
Yes, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, it was considered, which of course in itself was groundbreaking visually, but yeah, it is interesting how all of this evolves and changes. But I mean, Blade Runner itself, I mean, do you think, I mean, obviously visually, Blade Runner was a real feat and success, and has obviously been an inspiration. But do you think that part of the reason that Blade Runner still endures is because of its thematics and what it's talking about, and those sort of questions? Do you think that that's the reason that it's not just because of its visuals and stuff, but because of what it's actually about?
I think that's an important reason. I don't think it's the reason. I don't think there is one reason why Blade Runner endures. I think it's such a unique cocktail of things and elements and flavors that I think it's almost impossible to replicate. No pun intended. I think it's kind of it really is a one-off, and I feel like a lot of Blade Runner's greatness comes from the limitations that they were under back then. One of the big reasons why there's so much darkness and rain and steam and neon and atmospherics is to basically hide the sets, because if you look at photos of the sets, which are, they're amazing sets, but if you look at them in broad daylight, they're not particularly convincing. They don't transport you to that future world that you want to be transported to. So that's why, Ridley hid everything in the shadows. And that's what made it so mysterious and intriguing. It's like, what's around the next corner? What's hiding in those shadows? What story is down the street that I want to find out more about? That's kind of where the mystery of Blade Runner, I think, really developed. And then when you add on top of that the thematics and the philosophical angles of it, it just enriches it even more. So it's like you're not just dealing with fashion or spectacle, you're dealing with a deeper meaning. And I kind of think that's why the film has this very strange, again, for lack of a better term, magic that works on me personally. And you can't. I mean, as speaking for myself, as we saw with 2049, you can't copy that, and that's why I think it was probably smart for Denis Villeneuve to go off in a slightly different direction that was more his own, because, I don't think it was for him to try to copy the DNA of Blade Runner, or the original Blade Runner, and that's why in some ways I think it's a very strong science fiction film, but it's not a great Blade Runner sequel to me. It's like I can watch that film and say, wow, this is an incredibly well made movie, well directed, great performances. But is it a great Blade Runner sequel? That I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever know an answer to that question because I'm so biased. But that's the thing, is like I think you could potentially tap into the original DNA of Blade Runner. You have to almost recreate all the limitations, all the conflict, all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into the film back then, and that's a near impossible task. You might come up with a slightly different parallel version of it, but you're not going to ever tap into what created that first film. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of lightning in a bottle. It's one of those kind of, I know that's a phrase that's coined a lot, but it is kind of one of those, special mixtures of formulas of that just sort of happened. Everything happened right at the or not so right at the time, and that cocktail is what we came up with. But I mean, I think limitation is the key thing throughout, because like you said, there were the physical on set sort of limitations when the shadows, which obviously gave it that very film noir look and stuff. But also, while I was watching it, as I said, I saw it at Secret Cinema, and it shows how popular the film is still, because it was absolutely packed, the whole event, and they did it really well. But while I was watching the film, and again thinking about the film and listening to the dialogue and stuff, and the the whole idea of, you know, the replicants, even though, you know, they've got this kind of, you know, enhanced strength and intelligence and eyesight, and, you know, all of these things, you know, they're limited to a 4-year lifespan. And you just think, wow, you know, when I think how quick, you know, 4 years fly by, and you just sort of think, you know, I guess the older you get, the more you think about this as well. But, you know, you just sort of think, shit, you know, if ever there's a limitation, you know, in a story thing, that's it. And you know, you kind of feel for them, and that's what's, you know, that's what's so great about the film, and when obviously, you know, the original literary work, as well as what Ridley and team did with it. But you know, it is those sort of questions that it raises, and the fact that it is, you know, like I said, as a kid, I was used to films being much more sort of good versus evil, you know, cut and dry, black and white, beginning, middle and end sort of thing, and wasn't expecting what I got when I first saw Blade Runner, and the fact that it is more open to interpretation, and it's not necessarily, well, especially if you watch the director's cut, not necessarily conclusive, and you know, just sort of takes you in this area, and I think, you know, it's to recapture that and to do that again is going to be very, very tough. Hence why they've had to take it in other directions, and you know, separate it by 30 years, etc. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably as best a feature as a sequel that they could have got. I knew going into it they would never outdo the original, and you know, it was, I enjoyed watching it, but it didn't hit me the same way as Blade Runner did. And I think taking out the 4-year lifespan, because I believe that the replicants in that film don't have a short lifespan because it's never mentioned. I mean, also the fact that replicants are now allowed onto Earth when originally they were banned, and hence why the Blade Runners. But did you guys ever read the sequel book that came out, I think, in the 90s?
I haven't. No, I have to say I haven't.
There were like 3 of them, I believe, 3 sequel books. Like one was called Replicant Night or something like that. I didn't know. I didn't read any of them. To me, it's like I have enough on my plate.
With Lawrence of Arabia, you have enough on your plate.
But
yeah,
they're actually canon. You know, to go sort of off canon is, I'm not. You know, I'm not that young anymore.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. That's, if they had made a sequel, I'd say back in the 90s, this is probably how they would have gone. I mean, the story was that that Deckard comes back to LA because Rachel was dying. She's been put into some sort of hibernation capsule, and it's actually Tyrell's niece is now running the company, so he's having to deal with Rachel's double, and she is more or less tearing the company apart from within. And I remember it was all right. It wasn't, you know, it was slightly predictable, and I think the sort of spoiler but twist ending was that the niece actually replaces Rachel at the end, and Deckard goes off with her, kind of knowing that this isn't Rachel, that he's actually, you know, that he's actually let Rachel die, which I thought was really, I don't know, it left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. But yeah, I remember reading it ages ago and thinking, well, I'm glad that they never went this way with any of the films or anything, or with the sequel we did get.
Nah, it's not canon. So
This is true, but
it's that alternate reality Blade Runner. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, you know, We haven't quite got the flying cars yet, have we?
No, we haven't.
We've got drone cars now, so you know.
We do. Yeah, no, you know, and obviously Atari never ended up quite as big. But you know, but no, I mean I love the world, and I love the fact that it is removed from our world, but at the same time similar. And yeah, I just think it's I think it's really exciting, and I absolutely love the final cut. I just think that's, you know, perfect, because as I said, it's fixed those niggly little continuity errors and stuff, and it's expanded on, you know, some of the skyline and stuff, and it's just, yeah, it looked fantastic, trust me. And they did a really good thing. Secret Cinema did you know, that they have some scenes which they've got sort of live action reenactments in with the film, and you know, they did it really well. They did it really well. I was impressed. All it did, it made me really regret that I did the Star Wars one, was my first ever one, but the year before that they did Back to the Future.
Oh, right, yes.
They recreated Hill Valley in the 1950s, and I just thought to myself, oh my God, I so wish I'd bloody gone to that, but I didn't. But there you go.
I went to the Back to the Future one.
Oh, did you? Oh, I'm so jealous. That I'd have loved to have done that. I mean, there was something special about Star Wars being the first one for me, because as we've already covered in other podcasts, Star Wars was the first for lots of things for me. But yeah, I kind of I would have loved to have done the Back to the Future one. I'm intrigued to know what they're going to do next, but they certainly did do a good job of recreating the world of Blade Runner and immersing you in it. So that was a lot of fun. You know, maybe this is the next thing. Yeah, maybe this is the future. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there's I don't know. Have you guys tried out the Secrets of the Empire VR experience? Do you have that over there?
We do. I haven't tried it. Have you tried it, Keith?
No, it's actually one of those things on my list of things I want to do for sure, but I haven't tried it yet. No.
I highly, highly recommend it. It really, you know, I was very sort of like snobbish about VR, and I was sort of like, I'm good. I don't need to go do that. And I got sucked into doing it, and the Secrets of the Empire VR experience was just phenomenal, and it's completely changed my mind about next level virtual reality and what it could be, because there's a moment in it when it's like you and three friends, you're basically rebels who put on stormtrooper costumes, uniforms to infiltrate an Imperial base.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. So you're wearing like in the real world, you're wearing this vest, and you have your VR helmet on, and the vest has little sensors that'll, you know, pop if you get hit by a blaster bolt or whatever. But you're in this room that's in the VR space. You're basically like an elevator or a cargo ship. I can't remember how it begins, but you're basically being transported to this base. And there comes a moment where you walk through the door, but you literally walk through the door. It's not like you're on rails and you're standing there the whole time and it's taking you through doors. You are physically walking through doors. And when I had that first experience of walking through a door and like onto a platform and then onto another platform and then having to, you know, shoot other stormtroopers and things like that, that's when I realized, oh, this is so much more fun because, you know, you are fully in this world, you know. So I think if Blade Runner could do something like that, where it's not you sitting in a spinner, you know, like they had at Comic-Con last year. Was it last year? That it allows you to take your time and just do your thing, which is what, for me, what I love about Blade Runner's atmosphere and the world is it's just kind of just bluesy, kind of melancholy, kind of just very mysterious and just strange world that you just want to check out at your own pace. You know, you don't want to be tied to a story of, oh, I got to figure out who the replicant is, so I'm going to go scan this guy's, you know, eye, or I'm going to give him a void conf test or whatever. You just want to wander. And that's kind of what I hope one day is they create a Blade Runner VR experience where you can just wander, but like physically, like you're in VR, but you're walking through spaces, and you can kind of take your time. That to me would be, when you say what's next, the secret cinema thing is great. It's awesome and so much fun, but you're still sort of like at the whim of other people that are there who may or may not be as faithful to the experience as you are, or people who are basically pretending to be Deckard or Leon or Pris or whatever, and they're basically cosplayers.
Yeah.
I want like a virtual space where I can just take my time and wander. And there's this guy, his name's Quentin. He I don't know if you saw this VR of Deckard's apartment that he created. I don't have the link in front of me. Maybe I can find it really quick. But you guys have to check that out because it is it's phenomenal. It is such a faithful recreation of Deckard's apartment. Quentin Lengele, I think he pronounces his name like that, maybe. But he's on Twitter, and he got shut down. Actually, I think it was because it was so good. They got like a copyright cease and desist on it. But you guys have to check it out because it's all it is. It's Deckard's apartment. But you can walk anywhere. You can go out to the balcony and see the city, just like Deckard does in his robe in the movie. And I think for true Blade Runner fanatics, like that's kind of the thing. It's not a mission. It's not shooting replicants. It's not flying your spinner and dodging refinery towers or whatever it is. It really is about just living in that world. So hopefully one day it'll get there, and maybe that's the next thing.
Wow.
Maybe
it's the experience. I love it. I've got to ask, with the Star Wars thing that you're in, presuming you could see a thing in that helmet anyway, when you look down, did you so when you look down at like your arms and your body and stuff, you totally see all the stormtrooper armor and stuff, yeah? Oh man, Simon, we're going. We're fucking going, right?
Okay.
I want to do that.
you do. There's all kind of Easter eggs. So I would say feel free to touch anything. Like if you see, K2SO talking to you, go touch him, and maybe he'll react. I don't know. We'll see.
Oh, okay.
But the best thing is like it's a really beautifully designed. I mean, if the one there is like the one that I did in LA in Anaheim, it's just so well done with the details of it, and I didn't want to leave. I wanted to go back right into it, and it's also there's heat, there's fumes, there's all this atmospheric stuff that you feel, So yeah, it's really incredibly well done, and I guess a new Alien VR experience just opened up in LA, so I'm going to be out in LA.
Wow. Okay. Excellent. By the way, you didn't end up in a trash compactor, did you?
No.
Okay. That sounds amazing. But you're right. I mean, maybe that will be the next thing. I mean, that they've always been trying to sort of get these secret cinema is kind of an evolution of what they did, a couple of decades back or whenever it was with the whole Terminator 2 3D thing, Battle Across Time, where they tried to make that, a 3D movie with live action stuff and sort of immersing you in it. And, now they've done secret cinema, which is, immersing the entire public in that world. But like you said, the next evolution, I think VR is going to be big, and maybe that'll be the next thing. And we talked on a last podcast, so you may end up in holosuites or something, holodecks at some point in the future. Who knows? Hopefully not. Hopefully before the 24th century, maybe.
Well, I think that's the way it's going. I think it's the challenge is how to tell stories within that without it feeling like you're on rails. That's the challenge.
So it'll be Ready Player One for sure.
Yes.
Cool.
I don't know if I'd want to live in that world as much as I'd like to visit it. But I mean, if you're, in VR space 90% of your life, I mean, how do you go to the bathroom?
Yeah, yeah.
How do you eat?
Well, I mean, it has all sorts of social issues around it, doesn't it? Let's be honest.
Yeah.
And the economy and all sorts of things. But
Oh yeah.
A whole nother podcast.
I was just thinking that maybe the VR suits are like the stilt suits from Dune.
Oh, there you go.
See, that would be perfect, because if you did a Dune VR experience, you could just wear the still suit and be doing Dune. So it's kind of like it's the win-win.
Double whammy.
Exactly.
As long as it's not like the Lawnmower Man, we'll be fine. See, we're hitting all the highs and lows of movie references today. So yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, I mean, obviously this it's a massive topic that we could we've just probably scratched the surface of. But and I know, Charles, you've talked about Blade Runner so much that you're probably tired of it. But any other things anybody wants to add?
I will just say, earlier you mentioned you saw the director's cut in '92, and that the director's cut kind of fixed some problems. But I always have to remind people there are about, or maybe even over, 100 picture changes in the final cut versus the director's cut.
Yes.
And I always feel like I need to point that out, because people say, oh, they just fixed some shots and they just tweaked it. It's like, that was a multi-year restoration.
Oh, no, I didn't mean to make it sound trivial. Sorry, that wasn't my intention.
No. Somebody did that. But that's always something I feel I need to clarify whenever I see someone online or on Twitter just kind of say, oh, it's not that big of a deal. It's like, well, actually it is. And we did tons of tiny, like I actually, when we were wrapping up on the final cut, I'm not going to mention the name, but there was a fan site that, they wanted to talk to me about it. And I said, well, if you want, I'll actually put together a comprehensive list of every single change we made for the final cut. And they're like, oh, no, we don't want that. We don't think anyone would want to see that. And so I never did it, because there was no interest. And frankly, again, it's like, you don't have time to do things that aren't going to be used. So now I kind of regret it. So now I'd have to go through and watch the movie again and maybe, make a whole new list of it. But I mean, there's a ton of changes in the final cut, and that in a perfect world, you won't even notice. I mean, Blade Runner fanatics would notice it, would notice all of them. I mean, obviously there's incredibly obvious ones, like, how we fixed Zora and the dove flying in the sky, and,
and Gaff's eyes and stuff like that. Yeah.
We didn't touch Gaff's eyes, actually. That's one thing. Like, there are a couple of things we deliberately didn't touch because we thought that's a slippery slope, and we could just go on and on forever. But I would say the final cut is extremely close to, I think, what anyone could reasonably call a perfect version of the film. There's two things, which I'm not going to say what they are, but there's two things I still like to fix. But that's for another generation and another format, many years from now. But anyway, so it's like, I think the final cut is. I'm glad that people seem to like it. I mean, there are it has its dissenters. There are people who prefer the theatrical cut because they like the hard-boiled narration, and they prefer the more naturalistic color correction and things like that. And again, that's why they're all in the box set, so you can enjoy whichever version you want.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I do actually, when I watch the final cut, I do kind of miss some of the continuity errors and, obvious stunt people.
Yes.
But it's still, that's the thing though, it's, as you say, you've got the director's cut version, you've got the theatrical cut, and you've got the final cut. So there's a version for everybody. And, but it's still the same film.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing how little Joanna Cassidy had changed in that 25 years, wasn't it? That's quite interesting to watch on the documentary, and also the painstaking thing with you know, the lips and Harrison Ford's son and all that sort of stuff. That's really, yeah, amazing. There, you know, no, I realized there was a shitload of work that went into this, and you know, it does look fantastic. So yeah, no, absolutely. I wasn't meaning to say it was just the director's cut with a few fixes. That was, but no, it's yeah. I was totally on to dish you, Charles. What can I say? But no, it really is fantastic, and it is great that all the versions are there intact, so you can sort of choose whichever one, you know, you want as your version.
You know, we almost went one step further. I proposed, I think I called it custom cutter was the phrase, where you could create your own edit of Blade Runner, because on the disc that has the archival versions, which has the theatrical cut, the international cut, and the director's cut, you know, those three versions fit on one disc through seamless branching.
Yes.
And so what I was going to propose, and I did propose it, and I actually kind of designed what the menu would look like, would be almost like a series of switches, of like toggles, where you would say yes to voiceover, but no to unicorn, and yes to happy ending, but no to this. And you could actually tailor the cut of the film based on, you know, on the major differences between the different versions. Because there are some people who say, I wish I had the voiceover, but not the stupid happy ending, you know? So again, I was doing my best to give everybody what they wanted, but it just seemed a little too, at the time, a little too advanced in terms of authoring. And we didn't want to have any glitches in the disc, because already, you know, seamlessly branching three movies together on one disc is already a feat. So
yes.
Add that extra bit of complexity might have been a disaster. But, you know, maybe someday they'll do something like that.
There you go. There's the next one. It's the hybrid cut. So the choose your own adventure cut. Yeah.
Yes.
Of course, this philosophically goes against almost everything I believe in, and in terms of the filmmaker's control over their movie.
Yes.
But you know, again, if the director is okay with it, then I guess it's you know, why not try it out? But I would never want anyone to do that to my movie, so therefore, you know, I didn't work too hard on it.
I remember in the 80s they did the BBC actually did a series where people actually voted on what was going to happen next, and as they never did it again, I imagine it wasn't much of a success. But I do remember it was all like, you know, you phoned in, and they it was like they must have done, because I'm just trying to remember this off the top of my head, but I think they must have had some options. It couldn't have been like people call up and say, well, why doesn't he just run off then, or, you know, crazy stuff like that.
Yeah, I seem to remember there was a thing called Murder in Space or something, where there was more than one ending and you could kind of choose which it was, and I can't for the life of me really remember much about it, so obviously didn't make much of an impression. But I seem to remember something like that at one point, but I don't know. Yes, I'll have to look into that. I'm sure there was something like that back in the day. You know, we're always experimenting with this different way of storytelling and different way of representing and presenting it. It's interesting. It's, who knows what's next?
Yeah, one quick question: does anybody know if there are any fan edits out there of Blade Runner?
Yes, there are.
Oh, okay.
There's one, I think it's called the White Dragon cut, and I think it includes all the deleted scenes in it. Basically anything that's, you know, that didn't make the final cut, I think it tries to restore all that stuff. And it takes some liberties with transitions and visual effects and, you know, certain moments that were never fully finished. I think it tries to cobble together with its own new shots and things, but I've not seen it because, frankly, I feel like, you know, I've seen Blade so many times and
Yeah.
so many ways. And I worked on it for so long in terms of the restoration and the special features that I'm good. You know,
Yeah.
there's some amazing thing I've got to see how I'll go see it. But if it's just putting everything back in, it's like I can imagine that pretty well.
Yeah.
And I do have to say, probably the most fun I had in terms of all the special features was putting together those deleted scenes, like as a little mini movie, a 47-minute kind of like Blade Runner 5.5 version of the film, because it was really intoxicating to have access to the dailies and to cut it together in our own way, because there was, with the exception of maybe 4 of the deleted scenes, it was all raw footage that had no, rough cut or work print or any guide to go off of, other than, we looked at the footage, we tried to figure out what made sense, and then we cut it together in the best possible way. And then on top of that, the extra bonus of having discovered the original voiceover recording sessions with Harrison Ford that had entirely different dialogue than what was in the theatrical cut. So we had all of this completely unheard Harrison Ford narration, and we didn't originally know, how to house that within the disc. And then I thought, well, why don't we, in addition to the deleted scenes we know we have, why don't we go into the dailies, pull alternate takes and other angles that we've not seen before, and stitch together a version of the film or the deleted scenes rather, that support this unheard VO. And that was an enormous amount of fun to do that. Like, that was literally going into these amazing dailies and cutting together your own version. That's probably the most fun and satisfying experience I've ever had doing this behind the scenes stuff.
No, that's great.
Very cool. Yeah, very cool. Excellent. Well, anything else?
I think that's it.
We really could, be here all night, but we can't do that. So I hope whatever listener that was is happy with our sort of rather impromptu little discussion and tour of Blade Runner and other aspects of cinema. And if they do like it, maybe they could go onto iTunes and give us a review. That would be nice.
Yes.
Charles, thank you as always for coming and joining us on these things. We always find what you've got to say very interesting and insightful, and really appreciate you being part of it. So thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me. And if you ever do another podcast about The Last Jedi, you have to include me in it.
Oh.
Not another Last Jedi podcast.
Oh, dear. I actually do think there will probably be more to come at some point. Yes. I'm still grappling with The Last Jedi. Simon very kindly bought me the Blu-ray for my birthday recently, and I watched the feature-length documentary on that one, which I found very interesting. I've yet to watch the film with commentary, which I will do, but I did check out all the deleted scenes, and in my opinion, it was a mistake not to have the Luke's reaction to Han, the news about Han not being in the film. I think that was a mistake, but that's my opinion. There you go. Anyway, that's a whole nother podcast, maybe with Charles sometime in the future.
Yes.
I'm a big Last Jedi defender, so I will take you on if there's another.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
I'm sure there will be.
Yes. So, Keith, where can people find your work?
Okay, well, if you go to YouTube and put in British Eyles, which is EYLES, as in my last name, there are short films there that I've written, produced, and directed, all with no budget, by the way. And if you put my name into IMDb, you can see projects that or a selection of projects that I've done, both past and upcoming.
And as always, you can find my work at independentrunnings.com. You can listen to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, and all good podcast providers. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Just search Movie Heaven, Movie Hell. And please leave us a rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher. It all helps. So, thank you for listening to the podcast. And hopefully you'll join us again for the next episode of Movie Heaven, Movie Hell, which might be on The Last Jedi. Who knows?
I hope so.
Indeed.